Welcome to today's webinar discussing U.S. foreign policy challenges featuring Danielle Pletka. Thank you all for joining this afternoon. As you know, we could not do our important work here at Emmett without your continued support, which we greatly appreciate. Please do plan on joining us at our annual gala in Washington, D.C. on November 19th, as it's going to be a very special event, and it would be great to have you all with us in person. As always, our webinar will be recorded and available for viewing afterwards. We will send out the link, and I hope that you send it far and wide. I know that today's discussion is going to be critically important and very relevant to current events. If you have any questions for our speaker, you can put them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and I will try to get to as many as possible later in the program. A bit of a quick introduction so we can get right into our discussion. Danielle Pletka is a distinguished senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where she focuses on the Middle East, terrorism, and U.S. foreign policy. Until January 2020, Ms. Pletka was the senior vice president of foreign and defense policy studies at AEI. She teaches U.S. foreign policy toward the Middle East at Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service and is a political analyst for NBC News. Before joining AEI, Ms. Pletka was a senior professional staff member specializing in the Middle East and South Asia for the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. Ms. Pletka has authored, co-authored, and co-edited a variety of studies, monographs, and book chapters, and is a regular guest on television. She's been published in the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, The Hill, and Politico, among other outlets. Ms. Pletka is also the co-host with AEI's Mark Thiessen of the podcast, What the Hell is Going On? Making Sense of the World. I urge you all to follow Danny's very important work. She's brilliant, as you'll see in just a few minutes. So welcome, Danny, and thanks so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you for that lovely and lengthy introduction.
Well, you have quite a resume, so I'm thrilled that you're here to share with us your insights. And we're going to be discussing U.S. foreign policy, and obviously going forward, that's going to depend on who wins in 2 weeks. But we can focus on the impact that the Biden-Harris foreign policies have had on the various issues that we're going to be discussing. And that's what I'd like us to do. In recent interviews, Kamala Harris has stated that Iran poses the biggest threat to U.S. national security. And while some would disagree with her and place China at the top of that list, I'd like to spend some time talking about the Islamic Republic, given current events and given, of course, your area of expertise. We can't talk about Iran without acknowledging that the Obama-Biden-Harris policy of not just realigning the Middle East by destroying the Pax Americana that had kept relative peace and stability in the region for decades, but also empowering and enriching Iran as the regional hegemon, has actually led to the state of affairs that we see today, with Israel surrounded by a ring of fire in the form of 7 battlefronts. I want to begin by asking you your general thoughts on whether or not the tragedies of October 7th were a historic turning point in the region and the larger Iranian war against Israel. And we'll get into a lot of detail on that. But if so, shouldn't the U.S., no matter who's sitting in the Oval Office, be helping that along?
Look, it would be lovely. First of all, thank you. And thank you for all the work that you do and all of the people who are on. Without you, this debate would be all the more difficult. So, look, the question of what we need to do about Iran is the one that has plagued, more than just Obama, Biden, Harris. We've had every single president since the Islamic Revolution and before the Islamic Revolution, so Jimmy Carter as well, who had to contend with the threat that Iran posed. And we really have not actually successfully developed an answer. If we want to lay the proper groundwork here, what we really need to admit is that October 7th has been great for the Iranians. If you look at the global re-engagement on the question of Israel and the Palestinians, if you look at the tens of thousands of people we have seen marching in the United States and to a much greater extent in Europe in support of Iran's proxies and Iran itself, what you see here is, without losing a single actual Iranian, they have, through their proxies, managed to put this on the front page. They have managed to evade almost all responsibility for the actions of their proxies, and they have done so at the moment when neither the European Union nor the United States nor the United Nations has done anything at all about their nuclear weapons proliferation. So, if you're sitting in Tehran You may be looking up at the sky like that famous video of Ayatollah Khamenei worrying while he was at Ismail Haniyeh's funeral. But at the same time, you got to be telling yourself, dude, great work, nice job. And to a large extent, that's on us, right? We have allowed this to happen. And I always try to be fair. I look at what Barack Obama offered the United States when he ran for president, and he offered a different approach. It wasn't like he faked us out. He didn't say, I'm going to hit Iran hard and then suddenly go and embrace them. He said he was going to try and reach out an open hand to them. He did exactly that. Now, a lot of us think that the JCPOA, the Iran deal, was a bad deal, and it was a bad deal, but it wasn't like he didn't tell us he was going to make that deal. The problem for us is, since then, we have had no end game. The Trump administration had an excellent maximum pressure campaign that really strangled the Iranians, but it didn't strangle them with a view to actually getting anywhere. And they obviously reopened their nuclear weapons work and doubled down on it. The Biden and Harris administration has done absolutely nothing. Nothing. Okay. Ditto for the Europeans, all of whom were parties to the JCPOA. They haven't done snapback. They haven't gone to the UN. The IAEA has obviously deemed the Iranian program no longer compliant with any of the terms of the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, and it hasn't done anything. This is malpractice of the first order, and what the next president is going to have to deal with is an Iran with nuclear weapons.
So there's a lot of follow-up in that answer that was really insightful, Danny. But so I would argue that the one thing that the Biden-Harris administration has been doing is preventing a complete victory of Israel over Hamas, let alone Hezbollah, the Houthis, and ultimately Iran. I mean, the word don't seems to be their instruction when it comes to any offensive measure that Israel takes, whether it was preemptive strikes against Iran at the start of the war, just after October 7th, when that was on the table, retaliating after the April and October strikes by Iran, directly on Israel, going into Rafah, where even Kamala Harris threatened consequences because she studied the maps. I mean, now we have the most recent threat by Team Biden-Harris that it's going to join the various EU countries that have imposed an arms embargo on Israel if Israel doesn't provide more humanitarian aid to the Gazans, which we know is just insane. I mean, I don't know, what country ever under attack is to provide sustenance to the enemies who seek its annihilation. And then, of course, the term ceasefire has been parroted by Biden-Harris officials since October 7th, despite there being a ceasefire in place on October 6th. And even they're continuing this ceasefire peace plan after Sinwar's death. So isn't it true that Hamas, Iran, and the other proxies have been emboldened by U.S. policy that pressures and demonizes Israel rather than the terrorists that started this war?
Of course. I mean, but, look, I hate to say this, but all of that is true to the point of being obvious. And when I say that, I don't mean that as an insult to you, obviously. It is, we had, I don't know whether the folks on this webinar have heard him, but I commend him to you, General Frank McKenzie, who was the commander of CENTCOM, the Central Command, whose area of responsibility includes the Middle East, including Israel. And he was the commander at the same time, during the time that, that the Biden administration withdrew from Afghanistan. So, if you want to start at a moment that defines this administration, that's where you have to start. It's not that what they've done vis-a-vis Israel has emboldened the bad guys, all bad guys, right? Whether it's China or it's North Korea or it's Iran or it's Putin or, any of those. It is that is the moment when all of these actors decide that the United States is not a power to be reckoned with. Now, I do think that the Biden administration, I think coming out of the box, I think the president was actually pretty solid with Israel on October 7th. And I think a lot of us were happy because we recognized that there were a lot of very influential next gen, much further left people, including Vice President Harris, inside his administration. But that changed very quickly. And of course, the natural instinct of any administration is to lean on our friends, not our enemies, because it's so much easier to lean on your friends than it is. They listen to you. The Iranians don't listen to us. Joe Biden said no to them and don't to them, and they paid no attention because obviously that was a ridiculous approach. But I think the Israelis have been limited, as the Ukrainians have been limited, by the sort of pathological fear that the Biden administration has of a wider war. I don't want to suggest, and I'm not sure it's fair to suggest, that the Israelis have not been able to get the hostages out because of the Biden administration, because I think the reality is that Hamas never wanted to give up the hostages. They never had any plan to give up the hostages. And after the first hostage exchange, I think they were done. And I think there have been a lot of bona fide efforts on the part of both the Netanyahu government and the Biden administration to try to get a ceasefire done. Obviously, for different motivations, right? Because I think the Biden administration was always looking for a permanent ceasefire, and the Israelis were looking for a pause in order to continue to finish off Hamas. The problem is this, and again, if you want to, and I want to, go to why it is that the Biden administration has stood in the way of an Israeli complete victory, then you have to actually step back to where I stepped back before, which is the Biden administration doesn't want to deal with Iran. And in order to solve the Hamas problem, the Houthi problem, the Hezbollah problem, the Hashd-Shaabi, the guys in Iraq, those problems, you can't just kill Ismail Haniyeh and Yahya Sinwar and the head of Hezbollah, Nasrallah. You can't just do that. You got to deal with the Iranians. The Israelis, I think, are now more prepared than they've ever been to finally deal a serious blow to the Iranians. And the United States and the Biden-Harris administration are doing everything they can to stop them. So that's where I really fault them. This is a systemic problem. This isn't about one thing. This isn't about Hamas. This isn't even about Rafah. And what you said about the vice president is totally true. This is about the unwillingness of the United States of America to do anything about this regime in Tehran. And until we do that, we're not going to see the end of these groups.
So I'm going to get into a little bit more with Iran in a minute, but I want to turn north for a second. The Biden-Harris administration, together with the UN and many EU countries, seem to want to let Hezbollah off the hook. Also, we're hearing ceasefire up north as well, and I don't think that they realize, they're tying it together with Gaza. But like Israel, the U.S. isn't joining the obvious call for UNIFIL to leave southern Lebanon post and allow Israel to clear Hezbollah out with the least amount of collateral damage as possible. So can you discuss Lebanon and the mistakes that the administration is making in its policies up north as well, similar to the need for Israeli forces on the Philadelphia corridor in Gaza? What are the chances that anyone other than Israel can keep the land between the northern border of Israel and the Litani River in Lebanon clear of Hezbollah terrorists? Wouldn't Israeli forces be required, given the failures of UNIFIL, to enforce UN Resolution 1701 and keep Hezbollah out of southern Lebanon?
Look, the failure on 1701 has been the failure since the second it passed. Okay, that resolution, like too many UN Security Council resolutions, was a complete joke, a fig leaf over the fact that the United States cannot force the government of Lebanon, that no one can force, the people of Lebanon cannot force the government of Lebanon and the Lebanese armed forces to be serious about sovereignty over their own territory. And at a certain moment, we need to stop telling the lie that there is a government of Lebanon that is separate from the government of Hezbollah. Okay, so, in fact, I don't know whether people noticed, because in all of the stream of news, it's hard to pay attention to all the details, but it was very interesting to me that the Iranian foreign ministry said that it would negotiate with the United States on behalf of Lebanon in order to move towards a ceasefire in the north. if that doesn't tell you everything you need to know, I don't know what does. And I shudder to think that we might actually accept that. UNIFIL is, like most peacekeeping operations, no better than the people who make it up and their will. There is no peace to keep in the region. I don't know whether folks saw the story about the fact that the Hezbollah and others have been bribing UNIFIL soldiers in order to operate in their territory. Of course, UNIFIL should go. The American taxpayer should stand up and demand our money back, because we are the primary payer of UNRWA, UNIFIL, and every other one of these misbegotten UN human rights arms and agencies. And so, yes, UNIFIL is a huge problem. It's got to go. The Biden administration renewed its mandate without making any serious effort to change what it was going to do. And as for what the Israelis need to do, look, the Israelis need to do what the Israelis need to do. And I have been happy to see that they have, for the most part, been ignoring the strictures of, the Macron government in France, the Biden-Harris administration, and everybody else who's been wringing their hands about the fate of southern Lebanese, who they have not given a good goddamn, excuse my bad language, about over the last 25, 30 years, who have been crushed under the boots of Hezbollah's leadership. So, for me, Lebanon does not exist as a country. It was an adjunct of Syria. Now it is an adjunct of Iran. And to pretend, as this administration has with its envoy, Amos Hochstein, who has insisted that all we need to do is strengthen the Lebanese armed forces and Lebanese institutions, my answer is, you don't know what the hell you're talking about, because the Lebanese armed forces do not exist separate from the Hezbollah government, and Lebanese institutions are subordinate to Iran, period, end of story.
I mean, I think the most important point in this last comment that you made is that I don't think that there's anybody in this administration that understands geopolitics and understands certainly the mentality of many of the countries in the Middle East and what drives them. And I think that has led to horrific policy decisions. And I'm not sure how much is ideological, how much is ignorance. And when you talked a minute ago about this fear of Iran. I mean, do you think that that's part of goes back to really Obama believing that Iran could be a reasonable power broker in the region and would keep stability by pulling the U.S. out and replacing it with Iran? I mean, that to me was completely ignorant.
This is a whole much deeper conversation, because, look, I'm not going to say that Barack Obama, is dumb, or that the people who advised him are dumb, because they're demonstrably not dumb. These are people who went to the best schools. These are people who have had the best education. These are people who have sophisticated experiences. I do think that the word that you mentioned that is critical here is ideology. And the funny thing is that people like you and me, we get labeled as ideologues, and maybe we are, but there is an ideology that drives the foreign policy people on the left, and now the far left, in both the retreads of the Obama administration, who largely make up the foreign policy apparat of the Biden administration, and Harris's people, who are actually quite separate and different. There's no love lost between those guys. I only wish it was a right-left fight and not a left-far-left fight. But what they fundamentally believe, and not to make this sound too stupid, is that we're all the same. And see, we are all, we are all the same. We just have differing interests, right? The Iranians are driven in this worldview by a fear of the United States, and a fear of Israel, and a fear of being overthrown. And this is what pushes them to use all these proxies and to have this nuclear weapons program. And of course, if you think that way, then the right answer is to reassure them in the hope that they will not react that way. The problem is that's not how they think. And the unwillingness to recognize that actually they're not just like us, only in turbans and hijabs. They're not just like that, only browner or curlier hair or Shia. They are different. They have a different worldview. And anybody who's old enough or knows enough of history on this webinar to remember, World War II, the answer is you need to listen to your enemies and believe them, right? When the Iranians say they hope to destroy the state of Israel, that is what they hope to do. Just as Hitler said he wanted to annihilate the Jewish people, that's what he wanted to do. Just as Hamas said that it wants to kill all Jews, as do the Houthis, that's what they want to do. And I, for one, believe them.
So do I. So then, Danny, what would you like to see in an Israeli retaliation on Iran? The U.S. has been pressuring Israel not to attack the oil infrastructure, lest gas prices rise ahead of the election. There was a hard no on attacking the Islamic Republic's nuclear installations. And now we've got this serious leak of U.S. classified intelligence disclosing to Iran and the rest of the world Israel's plans for such a strike, which is an utter disgrace and certainly explains why Israel can no longer view the U.S. as a trusted ally. So in that regard, also, when you give us your response to this, what's the impact on Israel's ability to successfully deter Iran of the U.S. continuing to withhold critical munitions that Israel needs for what I understood to be a very successful attack on Iran, or Hezbollah for that matter, and that includes the 2,000-pound bombs?
Right. So I do think, look, I think Israel is to a certain extent dependent upon us for a reliable and continued supply of munitions. I hope that won't continue to be the case. One of the things that we see with the slow rolling over the last 2.5 years of U.S. support, military support to Ukraine, is that the Ukrainians are really investing in the manufacture of munitions at home, and they are going to be pretty close to independent within a couple of years. That may not be soon enough. The Israelis obviously have a very advanced military industry, but this is a big time war. Most of Israel's wars have lasted days and weeks. No war has lasted this long, and so that is an incredible amount of pressure on their supplies. That being said, I think they have what they need to move on Iran. I've written this in your very, very flattering and lovely description of me up at the front. You didn't mention our Substack because I didn't ask you to, but we have a Substack that goes along with our podcast called What the Hell is Going On? And I wrote in that, and I have said everywhere that where anyone will listen to me, Israel needs to hit Iran's nuclear sites, and they need to do it now. The notion that this will spark a wider war is laughable. It is a little bit like the warning from President Biden at a fundraising event, no less, that Russia was prepared to unleash Armageddon on us. Poor man. I do feel for him. I understand he's not quite, as well as he used to be, but that's ridiculous. Russia can't even defeat Ukraine. They're not going to take on NATO. Sorry for the dog. Shh. It's a good. I hope not. There he is. Just a second. Oh no. Sorry, guys. All right, back to this. Why should they hit them? The notion that the Iranians want a wider war after having attacked Israel twice with almost, I don't want to say everything they have, but certainly their absolute top echelon of most advanced weaponry, and done nothing more than injured a poor little Bedouin girl and murdered by accident a poor Palestinian schmo standing in the wrong place, tells us a lot about Iran's offensive capabilities, absent their nuclear weapons. Iran's foreign policy has probably never been in a better place. Iran itself, as a military matter, has never been weaker. And so now is the time, as the Israelis have successfully picked off every single one of the Hamas, the Hezbollahis. I wish someone would do something more about the Houthis. Now is the time they need to hit strategic Iranian nuclear sites. They need to do it. I wish they had done it many years ago. You know, if you look back over history, we have done nothing but look at the Israelis telling us this is a red line, that's a red line, this is a red line, they're almost as bad as we are in that regard, and they have not done what is necessary. They've done a lot of covert stuff, but they haven't done the necessary overt stuff. And so what I think they need to do is they need to hit Iran as hard as they can right now, because I don't know what the Iranians would do in retaliation, but I do know that it won't succeed, because I'm looking at their capabilities, as are most military leaders. And, you know, for October 7th, indulge me one more second. For October 7th, we had a terrific event at AEI, and we played it on our podcast as well, with Elliot Abrams, Eyal Hulata, who's the former Israeli National Security Advisor, and Dave Deptula, who designed the US air campaign over Afghanistan, who did Desert Storm. And I asked him what he thought about about the Iranian air defenses. And he looked at me and he said, put me in, coach. That's all I'm going to say. So, you know, I think of all the people who have an assessment of what their capabilities are, he certainly was well positioned to, and he doesn't think they're going to do anything. It's only these people inside the National Security Council who are driven by their ideological view, who think that an Iranian response will be intolerable. Sorry, that was a really long answer, and the barking, I apologize.
No, it was a great answer, and thank you. So we'll continue this for one more second. You know, you stated on a recent podcast that Iran has been humiliated by Israel's recent wins. But as we've been discussing, it seems like the U.S. isn't acting that way. We met at the NUFDI conference, which for the viewers is the National Union for Democracy in Iran. And regime change was a big topic of discussion at this conference. Many Iranians in attendance. So I know a lot of us are wondering if there is still a strong movement for regime change in Iran, and whether or not the U.S. can do anything to help that along. So can you share with us your thoughts on regime change, and maybe perhaps I can expand this a little bit and see if you can add in what you think a complete victory would look like for Israel with Gaza, Lebanon, and Iran.
Ooh.
Yeah.
So no, it is. And you know, different topics, but everybody who knows me knows I was a big supporter of the Iraq War. I remain a big supporter of the Iraq War. I think we did the right thing. I think when you liberate 25 million people from a terrible tyranny, generally speaking, you're doing the right thing. But the outcome has not been perfect, and there were moments when the outcome seemed worse than the regime that we had eliminated. And you're a dope if you don't learn from your own lessons. That doesn't mean I regret it, but it does mean that I ask much harder questions about the implications of regime change, because I understand how easy the operations are and how hard the aftermath is and how bad we are at it. Okay, we are bad at this. I love America. I grateful to everybody who serves in our government and our military, but we're not great at this. And so when we talk about this, I recognize that we have to do a lot more thinking, because there is an Iran part 2 that looks worse. And I want us to think about this. There is an IRGC, Revolutionary Guard military Islamist dictatorship in Iran that looks worse than the mullahs that are in power right now, because these guys, if you can imagine to yourself, are less sophisticated. These guys get out less. These guys are less nuanced than all of the folks who we've been dealing with. Now, that doesn't mean that we should shy away from it. Sometimes you got to defeat who you got to defeat, and then you got to do your best to make sure there's a good outcome. My fear is we don't think enough about how to get a good outcome. The United States engages in basically zero activity in order to try to help the good guys in Iran. Okay? And It doesn't matter how much Congress has demanded that they do this. It doesn't matter how much Republicans have demanded. It doesn't matter how much American voters, like the nifty people, have demanded that the administration do more to help Iran's own indigenous, freedom-loving people to do what is necessary to save them from this regime. We don't do anything. Not only do we do nothing, the Europeans do nothing. The Arabs do a little bit, but it's not in support of freedom. It's in support of sort of ankle-biting terrorism at that surrounding the regime. And if we wanted to be serious, we would need to pick the winners. And unfortunately, and you know, when you this is a disappointing answer for a lot of people, because they're going to say, no, we just need to get rid of them. And my answer is, look what a great job we did with the Palestinians. Look how well we helped them build their government. Look how well over 30 years we used our assistance programs to build them into the democracy-loving secularists that they are today. Oh, wait. Right. So, you know, what should we do? We should be doing more to help the Iranian people. We should be doing more to empower the Iranian people, but we should be doing more to think about what we want next. And as a government, unfortunately, whether Republican or Democrat, we have not done that with any seriousness. So that's the answer to question one, and a really long one, and probably a little bit of an unsatisfying.
Well, you know what, before we go on to questions, I want to
Push back.
play devil's advocate a little bit with this. Aren't the Iranian people different than the people of Iraq as well as the Palestinian people? I mean, you know, pre-revolution, it was more of a Western society. There wasn't this indoctrination that of decades, of generations of hate, as we see with the Palestinians. The Iraqis are not, you know, I mean, one of Biden's brilliant ideas was to split the country into three, you know, way back when. So are we comparing apples and oranges though when we talk about regime? I believe me, I respect I understand the IRGC threat, and that's frightening, but is there a difference between the cultures?
I want to say yes. Look at Afghanistan before the Soviet invasion. It looked a lot like Iran under the Shah. You know, women, med school, sophisticated Western music, short shorts, the whole nine yards. You know, but Afghans aren't Persians. Persians are different. Persians are not Arabs, and one would like to think they are different. The problem for me is that most of us who deal with this were forged in the crucible that of the Iranian Revolution, right? That's when I started my career, and that's true for a lot of people in our business. And we want to believe that Iran is still the Iran that existed after 30 years under the Pahlavi family. You would be wrong. We would be wrong not to think that 45 years of rule of the mullahs, their education system, their news, their information, their military, their propaganda does not affect society, right? This is the mistake we made about Iraq. All my Iraqi friends are incredibly smart, sophisticated, tolerant, Jews, Sunni, Shia, Kurds, everybody, right? And then you get there and, oh my God, they're not the only ones voting. Damn. And the ones that are voting don't get it. So, you know, we need not to lie to ourselves about what, you know, you talked correctly about what 70 years of propagandizing about the Nakba has done to the Palestinians, right? They don't mean, you can't expect people to be better than the system that brings them up. That's a very unique trait. Ditto for Iran, and I worry a lot about this. And I know there are tons of great people. Let me tell you a little story, just a little story that will entertain everybody. at some point in the early 2000s, there were, I think it was the 2009 Green Revolution. We and a bunch of people we know helped one of the main movers, very, very important, charismatic, passionate young man, get out of Iran and come to the United States. And smuggling, it was hard. And he came, and we reached out and said, hey, I want to give you a platform. Got to come, got to talk about your experience, talk about what happened, talk about your dreams to the American people so they know you can be the voice of Iran. And he said, I would really love to do that, but I really need to meet first with Noam Chomsky.
Right.
Yeah, damn. I mean, my God, if I could have taken him and sent him back,
Yeah.
I might have. But this is the point, we romanticize this a little bit, and that happens, and especially for the Iranian American community who desperately want their country back and love their country and the soul of their people, but Noam Chomsky, folks.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, so I love your little anecdotes because they add to the interest, I think, on the insights on all of these topics. I want to be able to touch on Ukraine and China before I turn to some of the questions that people are posing. But I also need to touch on the Saudis. Because U.S. policy, we were on the 2-yard line at the end of the Trump administration with a normalization agreement between the Israelis and the Saudis. Biden turned the Saudis into a pariah for his first 1.5 to 2 years, and then realized that he needed them. So now Biden has been pushing for a Saudi agreement that would involve a U.S. defense agreement, which would have to go to Congress for 67 votes. It's not quite the same thing that we saw, 4 to 5 years ago. But what has me concerned, Danny, is the rapprochement between the Iran and the Saudis. And are we losing even some of the Gulf states and the Saudis in particular, or is it possible that we could lose them to Tehran as Tehran makes this outreach to Arab countries, including even Egypt?
You described what happened with the Saudis perfectly. And, the Saudis have some agency in this. The murder of Jamal Khashoggi was not exactly the most clever thing that Mohammed bin Salman could have done to advance his modernization. But I guess my worry is this. And this is, by the way, a worry that is not confined to the Middle East. The problem for us is not that they end up in Iran's orbit. They're afraid of the Iranians. They're not stupid. They know the Iranians better than we do. They spend more time with them. They look at more direct subversion. The Saudis know full well what the cost of the Houthi takeover of Yemen has been, much better than we do, even though we encourage their incredibly useless war against them, unfortunately. The problem is that we are now viewed as an unreliable ally. And I want to go back to the Obama administration because I think that was the most important moment. And that is, obviously, that experience shaped the opportunity for the Abraham Accords, but now we've gone back to the future again. So let's just step back a sec. One of the things that horrified the Arabs was not that the United States was a bad ally to the Gulf, because we've never been an especially great ally. But they have always looked at the US-Israel relationship as the absolute gold standard, right? And if you will betray the Jews, the Israelis, what are you going to do to us, right? And of course, Obama did betray the Israelis, lied about, obfuscated, and then misled, and then falsely made promises about the implications of the Iran nuclear deal, and earned himself a pretty bad name in Jerusalem, but also all over the Gulf. Okay, so they go all in for the United States under Trump, Abraham Accords. They take a lot of risks of their own making, but still risks. And they go forward, and we get the Saudis right to the goal line. I know nothing about sports, but I think that's an apt analogy. And here's the problem again. Okay. They've got Biden. Biden immediately turns off the policies of the Trump administration. Fair enough. But Biden also betrays Ukraine. He betrays Afghanistan. Right? Yes, of course, he can't stand Netanyahu and has a less good policy on Israel. Plus, he's still sucking up to the Iranians and desperately trying to figure out some sort of JCPOA Mark II at the beginning. So, for them, it is that they don't trust us. And they're not going to get in bed with the Iranians and become part and parcel of the Islamic Revolution because they're Sunnis and they recognize exactly what the Iranian regime is. But they are going to mistrust us. And on the basis of that mistrust, they are going to make a whole bunch of stupid and bad and dangerous decisions. Okay. Getting in bed with the Chinese, getting in bed with the Russians, as the Emirates have. And I still, to this day, am gobsmacked by the bad choices that they have made. I wrote this piece in Foreign Policy, and I called it the Qatarization of the Middle East. This is what we're looking at, is that trimming, playing both sides, not being willing to help us, not being willing to take risks for us, being completely transactional over petroleum exports, and playing footsie when necessary with the Iranians. So yes, this is all a huge problem, not just there, but also for everybody in NATO, all those countries that are just beyond Ukraine, but even more. And these are the people who should really be biting their fingernails, the Taiwanese.
Okay, so I'm glad we'll transition into other aspects outside of the Middle East for a moment, even though, as you point out, it's all sort of tied together. In a recent National Review column, Noah Rothman wrote, quote, Russia's war in Ukraine is fast becoming a proxy battlefield in a global conflict between the forces arrayed in support of the US-led global order and the authoritarian despotisms that seek to overturn it. And my first reaction in reading that was, what US-led global order? Because we haven't seen one, I don't believe, since Biden entered office. But now we're learning that North Korea is sending troops, possibly in the tens of thousands, into Ukraine to help the Russian army, making it a co-combatant in the largest land war in Europe since World War II. It's doing so in exchange for Russia providing the North Koreans with high-tech weapons technology associated with nuclear and missile programs. Couple this with the aid that China and Iran are providing Russia in the war, it looks like we're on the cusp of World War III, with this new axis consisting of Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea threatening the West. How concerned should we be, Danny, about Russia helping the North Koreans, all these countries working together? And it seems to me a feckless foreign policy over the past 3.5 years that's really brought us to a very dangerous place.
I think you pretty much summarized it there. George W. Bush called it an axis of evil for a reason. And we have watched supine over the last 2.5 years since the Russians invaded Ukraine. If we had done what we are doing now for the Ukrainians in the first 6 months, this would have been over. Okay, the Russians were terrible. They hadn't pulled up the mass reserves. The Chinese had not yet gone all in on Putin. The North Koreans weren't there. The Iranians were not sending drones. I think one of the things that we don't talk about as much, although there's been some good reporting on it, even in the New York Times and the Wall Street, and definitely in the Wall Street Journal, they have one of their top foreign correspondent is awesome, Yaroslav Trofimov. But what we're seeing is that all of them are interested in the Ukraine battlefield and the performance of their weaponry against US material, against NATO material. And they are looking to learn, measure, effectiveness, telemetry, counter operations. They are looking to learn from this battlefield in the same way that we are, but to a lesser extent, because we are being governed by feckless idiots. And, this is a nightmare because we don't have enough material to go up against the Chinese for more than a week. We just don't. we could beat the Russians if we needed to. NATO could beat the Russians, even, with the lousy Germans at all, as part of it. But in terms of a better resourced, deeper enemy, we are not in a good place at all. And this should be a wake-up call to the American people. This should be something where both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump are like, I'm going to be putting more money into the military. And instead, what we see from our data nerds at AEI is that our defense investments have flatlined. We are spending more and more of our defense budget on entitlements, on healthcare, on pensions, on education, and less of it on innovation, research, or weaponry. If it weren't for this Ukraine war, and I commend all of my colleague Mark Thiessen's work on this, if it weren't for this Ukraine war, we would not be modernizing the stuff we have in military depots. We wouldn't be replacing our ammo. We wouldn't recognize that we have an ammo shortage. We wouldn't be upgrading our stuff. It's only because of the fact that we are handing some of it off to Ukraine that we are buying newer and better material for our military. But we're shortchanging the American people. We are out of our minds. I don't know whether this is World War III. All I want is for us to be good enough to deter World War III. And right now we're not.
Frightening seems to be the word that I always come back to when I have these discussions. What are your thoughts on Zelensky, Ukrainian President Zelensky's latest declaration that Ukraine will seek nuclear weapons unless it's given NATO membership?
Lord love that man. He's amazing. I think absent him, this war would have been over a long time ago. And I think it sucks to be Volodymyr Zelensky. Look at your allies, look at the Biden administration, which is constantly telling you, don't hit this, don't hit that, don't do this, don't do that, take this, take that. And then Donald Trump, right, on this, Zelensky was at fault for this war. I would find a peace agreement within 24 hours. God only knows what the hell that would look like. But let us be completely honest about this. Donald Trump isn't the only one. The patience for this war in the Democratic Party has waned completely. We're not fighting this war, but they are war weary. It's like Iraq. We are so weary. It's like, what are you doing? But in any case, so Zelensky is in a terrible position. And for him, I think, the Ukrainians have been lied to by the international community on repeated occasions, including at the moment that they gave up the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And they were told, you don't need this, right? We will be there for you. And the answer is, well, we'll be there for you up to a point, and then we kind of get bored. And so, this is disastrous for him. And I think he is grasping for more and more extreme ways to galvanize the international community in his support. I don't know whether folks saw the man I love to hate the most, Antonio Guterres, was invited by the Ukrainians to a conference, which he declined, and then was invited by Putin to this ridiculous BRICS conference in Kazan, which he attended. Again, this is not a great time to be the good guy in this world.
No, and Guterres is just awful.
The
So I do want to leave a couple minutes for Q&A, but we have to talk about China. And I'm very concerned about it spying on US critical national security infrastructure. There was the Chinese balloon last year that traversed the entire country before we shot it down. And now we've learned this past week that last December, there were mystery drones that swarmed above Langley Air Force Base for 17 days. There were similar incursions over Edwards Air Force Base in California, the Energy Department's Nevada nuclear security site, et cetera. So, I think we're all presuming that this was conducted by the Chinese. Maybe, Danny, you have different insights, but how concerned should we be about Chinese spying on our sensitive military institutions?
Oh, are you kidding? Our hair should be on. Absolutely. Mark hosted the chairman and ranking member of the Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party, whatever the hell they call themselves, a couple weeks ago at AEI. We put that on the podcast as well. They were terrific and will give you new hope for bipartisanship, but every word they uttered was an increased, oh my God, because you know what? Countries do spy on each other. Okay, we spy on the Chinese spy on us. That's the reality of this world, and that's bad. And we can agree that's bad. It's dangerous. The administration isn't doing enough about it, blah, 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 blah. But what we should be hysterical about is TikTok. Okay. 30% of people get their news from TikTok. Yeah, it's insane. The virulent anti-Semitism, the Communist Party propaganda, and the just viral garbage. And I'm not talking about cat videos, I'm talking about political stuff. These people who run TikTok, the communists in China who run TikTok, can cause waves of action on the part of the American people. Right? We see this, and we haven't acted yet to shut it down. I hope it'll happen in the next couple of months. The members of Congress went through other stuff. 80%, just one factoid, 80% of the cranes, something really boring that none of us think about 99 times out of 100. The 80% of the cranes at US ports are made in China. All of them contain a backdoor cellular device that can control its operation. Imagine what happens if we're in a war. And that, then think about Huawei. We've spent billions ripping Huawei out of our system. What about the Chinese drones that some people in our military are still to this day using, that are transmitting information back to the Chinese? You could go on and on and on and on, and we need to be hysterical about this. And I'm really happy. One of the things that chairman or the ranking member, I can't remember, said is, look, we're not concerning ourselves with smoking guns, because by the time you've got a smoking gun, it's already been shot. He said, we are concerning ourselves with the loaded guns the Chinese have at our heads here in the United States. And I think that is 100% correct. It's one of the few areas of bipartisan agreement that we've seen, and thank God.
So do you have any thoughts on Taiwan? I mean, recently, I think it was last week, the Chinese had warplanes very close to Taiwan. And turning to the Q&A, somebody asked not just about Taiwan, but also about South Korea.
I think we're going to betray Taiwan. If you had asked me a year ago, I would have said we weren't. I am very nervous about this. And I actually always quote one of my favorite people, Dick Cheney. Years and years ago, right after 9/11, he was on one of the Sunday shows, and he was asked why it was that the Europeans weren't stepping up to the challenge, and that we were militarily. And he said, because they can't. And that answer is incredibly important. The Europeans have aligned their foreign policy to match with their military capabilities, right? If you can't do it, you don't do it. And if you don't do it, you have to find a reason not to. And this is my fear about China. And what I've seen is a change among some of the people on the right who insisted that we didn't focus on Ukraine because we needed to focus all our attention on Taiwan and China, and are now saying, Taiwan just can't be a priority for us. This is the way the wind is blowing, and it is very, very dangerous.
Someone's asking, and I had my own question, didn't get to it, on Qatar. Is Qatar as dangerous as Iran? Someone's asking about Khaled Mashal being, given safe haven in Qatar. What are your thoughts?
My venom for Qatar knows no bounds. Their ability to buy and sell Americans is, to me, staggering. The fact that we just renewed our air base in Qatar our air base, which, by the way, just on the most simple, basic, strategic basis, shouldn't be there. The fact that they own Al Jazeera and run it, and that Al Jazeera is not simply an enemy of Israel and a friend to Al Qaeda, ISIS, Hamas, Hezbollah, and everybody else, but an enemy to the United States. The fact that the Taliban, Al Qaeda, ISIS, Hamas, and all of those guys live in and have all their money in and are supported, as are the Houthis in Doha, is a nightmare. Our unserious, it's not that Qatar itself is going to invade somewhere. It is that these are enemies and facilitators and sponsors of everything that is anathema to our interests and the interests of our allies. And there's been a turnaround in Washington, but not a complete turnaround. And we are still looking at think tanks taking a ton of money and direction from them. We're looking at individuals taking a ton of money. Schools, you can associate, you want to ask about anti-Semitism on campus, look at who Qatar is giving money to. It's not the sole causation of that for sure, but it is a major factor. News agencies. I was just invited to a party 2 nights ago, and I'm not going to say who, but a well-known new media concern being celebrated by the Qataris. Yeah, what do you think that means? It's a nightmare, and we're idiots. Not to put too fine a point on it.
No, that's I amen to that.
Doing great work on this, by the way, is FDD, the Foundation for Defense
Yeah.
of Democracy. Cliff May, Dubowitz, all of those guys are doing great work. I commend them to you for that.
No, thank you, Danny. They are all regulars on our webinars, and I'd love for you to become a regular on our webinars as well. Someone asked the question, didn't our liberating Iraq from Saddam result in handing Iraq to Iran, similar to our handing Afghanistan to the Taliban? But I would take that a step further and ask you to touch on the Biden announcement that he is going to, I think he signed some sort of something forcing a complete withdrawal of U.S. forces from Iraq by 2026, and somehow making it very difficult for the next administration, whether it be Trump or Harris, to even reverse that. What are your thoughts on that?
Biden's been trying to get out of both Iraq and Syria for his entire presidency. I mean, Joe Biden, as Bob Gates said, Biden has been wrong about everything in foreign policy his entire life. And this is one of those things. I don't understand enough about exactly what the withdrawal looks like. I know that the initial discussion was just about, it was really a renaming exercise. I don't know what the final outcome was of that, and you remind me. I need to figure that out. Look, I think it is a fair question to ask. Did getting rid of Saddam Hussein remove one of the few kind of balancing powers in the Middle East on Iran? I think the problem with all such things is that they rely on a very straight line view of history, that in fact it always would have continued as it was. Iran and Iraq would have continued as they were, and we all would have continued as we were. And of course the answer is, the second that the sanctions were removed, Saddam would have returned to his nuclear weapons program. He would definitely have developed nuclear weapons. Then we would be looking at the Iranians, no holds barred, developing nuclear weapons. So instead of having an Iran that is on the cusp of nuclear weapons right now, and a region, the rest of the region, which has for the most part normalized with the state of Israel, we would have had 2 countries with nuclear weapons, both of whom were opposed to their neighbors, to Israel, to us. And so again, I think the problem for everybody who says if only it was the way it has been is that they look at a piece of history frozen in time and assume that it would have always continued. The person who said that first to me, and I miss him a great deal, is John McCain, and he was absolutely right about that.
I think that's a good way for us to end. It is 1 o'clock, and I appreciate the time. I know how busy you are. Even your dog in the background is
I know, oh my God, sorry.
He's adorable. I'm a dog person. So anyway, Danny, thank you a million. You were brilliant. Thank you everybody for joining, and I hope you do share the recording far and wide. I learned a tremendous amount from you, and I'm sure others would as well. So
Well,
thank you.
thanks so much. No, thanks to you and everybody for being on and for everything that you do. Definitely invite me back. I'd love to have you on. Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.